and I'm going to share a few things with you beforehand. I'm going to introduce you to another person you need to know about. Her name is Arlene Akel. Some of us are aware of Arlene's things, and hopefully you can see this. I'm going to get rid of, I hope, that the Bounty Land Warrants. She's a person who does a lot of blogging. She has a doctorate in history. She's got more energy than the Energizing Bunny. Her blogs are free. And today, as I talk about her, you're going to be able to go out and find her. Arlene is a great comrade and very good friend. And I've been listening to her very wise knowledge for the last 12 years. And she has a lot to offer all of us. And she's done a lot with bounty lands, especially in Virginia, Kentucky, Ohio. So we'll talk about her a little later. So there's one, and I'll stop that share. You don't have that, but you're going to have the reference to it in the presentation. Another one is the actual thing that you did get as a handout, the Military Bounty Land Resources with experts like Arlene Akel, et cetera, and places to find the books. And sometimes even if the book is not available in a local library, then, for instance, with the materials by a guy by the name of White, you can sometimes check them out online for 2 weeks. You just have to go out and look at each one of those separately. There isn't any one site. They make you do it that way. So this is about 2 pages or a little more of resources that I'm talking about and things that I've found. I warn you, it's not just books. It's also sites out on the web that are available to you. I'll stop the share on that and go quickly to the last one, because I just want to remind you again of the wealth of materials that you can find out at Family Search. And you want to go out and look at this site called United States Military Bounty Land Warrants and really go through it. I know what we usually do when we're looking at a site like this is we look just for that piece of information we need right now. And then, of course, we promise ourselves that we're going to look at the other later. Well, you know how that goes. So make a promise to yourself to take a look at this, because this one is really worth it. You're going to see some of the maps today that are available there and a few other things. But if you pay close attention, what I love about this site is this one and the National Park Service with regard to military really keep up with the information that is coming online. And so you're likely to always catch the newest and the latest that maybe wasn't even there yesterday or last week. So I'll stop the share on that one. And now I'm going to go in and actually begin the share, I hope, on the presentation. So without further ado, here we go. Military bounty land warrants and grants. Well, countries have been giving away land to their benefit for a long time, way before we became the United States, or in fact, way before we became colonies. But if you're looking at colonies, those lands were also granted in various ways in the hopes that it would benefit whoever headed a particular country, whether it was an emperor or a king or a queen or whatever, that there would be something that would be of benefit. My goal for you today is to give you an overview of bounty lands that were granted, and even some that were granted so much later that, of course, day late, dollar short. You'll hear me say that again and again. The United States was in the mood to give the land, but a lot of the people they were talking about that should have gotten the land were already, shall we say, departed from this life. I'm hoping you'll see a little bit about the types of bounty lands given and where that bounty land boundary or border stops, not in terms of the land itself, but in terms of years when it was no longer given. You're going to see the lands that were obtained by the U.S. government over time, and later some of it was given. I mean, if you look at the land that was given in Oregon, that was a different giveaway entirely from what we're looking at today. It's going to be helpful for you to know and learn the main points of bounty lands and the difference for each war, because it depended frequently on the length of service, the rank, who they served with, and who went to bat for them, candidly. All land given by the U.S. government was eventually given by statute or by succeeding statutes. They didn't quite finish this up till 1929, I'll warn you. And all land given by individual states was given by state statute. And frequently you're going to have to look at different places in order to find that land. That's where a person like Arlene Akel comes in, because not everything's going to be online. It's getting better every day, but you're going to have to dig. We're still working, for example, on the 1812 bounty lands. We're still working on various service records because no, not everything has been done. Land has been offered as an incentive by foreign countries beginning early on, and you're going to see us have to be aware of any lands that were granted. Of course, when we became the United States, we were dealing with land that had been granted to colonies, and that land frequently did not have a western boundary. We'll take a look at that. Because these colonies, as they became states, gave up some of the land at the request of the U.S. government. But in other cases, as we took in land, for example, in California or in Mexico, rights claimed by former citizens there also had to be taken into consideration. And so there's more to look at than just military bounty lands. You just need to be aware of this. And that land that was previously claimed as a result of a Spanish claim or a grant, for example, or a French claim, was often protected in the deals that the United States made. American colonies gave land as an incentive early on when they were involved in various kinds of wars. For instance, the War of 1763. And later on, land was given by the U.S. government as an incentive to get people into fight, for example, the War of Independence. Because remember, we were trying to figure out if we were a country at that point, and we really didn't have anything else to give. It was difficult to form that first military unit and all of those units. So let me just remind you of the United States early on. I have a list of English land grants that are shown on this map. And the most important one, I just want you to kind of concentrate on, is this one bounded by two green lines, MBC, which is the Massachusetts Bay Company. From 1629, you notice that it has New Hampshire in it. It has parts of other states in it, for instance, eventually Maine. But notice that it said it was from sea to sea. So it stretched westward a long way. So when you're looking at lands in Illinois, for example, and trying to figure out why there's a bounty land given there, you can look back to, for example, that Massachusetts Bay Colony and the land that it gave up to the United States government and what happened with that land. So just be aware of these particular things and be aware of other things like New Netherlands and what they gave up, where that land went, New Sweden, Quebec from the French, Port Royal, which we're not going to discuss at all. And of course, the Spanish land grants in down south and also in Florida, and as we move westward again. Remember, we didn't just start with we did start with the New England states, the original 13 states, but there's quite a picture here when you look at it. And I took this, I believe, straight out of Family Search, so you're going to be able to find this map pretty easily. But this is a list of all the ways in which we received land so that we had land to not only give as military bounty land when it was connected with something like the 1848 Mexican War, 1846 through 1848, or the War of 1812, or Indian wars of various types, but also land that we took in and then later on gave, because we've already taken a look in these talks with the original homestead land that was created through law by Abraham Lincoln in 1862. But if you look out at number 8 and you look at the Oregon Compromise, you're looking again at some things where you see, hey, even Montana was involved in that particular thing. And so you're looking at 1848, the Mexican cession being more than just part of Texas, being a great deal when you take a look at that. The Gadsden Purchase, which we made in 1853, and so on. Because when we took in these lands, of course, we had to get people to settle on them. Again, just looking at the land claims of the colonies, I know this is a little smaller, but if you look at the land out into the Great Lakes that has, it says it's claimed by Massachusetts through 1785 still. That's after we became a country. They were still claiming this and saying, wait a minute, if we give this up to the U.S. government, there are some things that have to be understood about military bounty land that we also gave early on, so those particular military bounty lands are still honored. So you can see down by North Carolina that the area that we call Tennessee today was claimed by North Carolina right through 1790 before they gave it up, and it became land that the U.S. government could give. So I'm not going to go into this map that much, but whenever you're thinking of those 13 colonies, think of westward extensions. Don't think of where they are today. That's why with Virginia, when you're looking at Kentucky and you're trying to find somebody from Kentucky and they were there early on before they were the U.S., you better be looking back at Virginia records. Or later on, Virginia had possession of some land in Ohio, and it gave those lands as a part of a state military bounty. But let's go back to the Congressional Act of 16 September 1776, when, in order to get people into this newfangled thing called the Continental Army, they were offered a parcel of land ranging from 100 to 500 acres, depending on their rank that they achieved during their time of service. Now, remember, when you look at that Continental Army, I've seen things where people served as little as 3 days. I've seen people who served for 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, or whatever. So again, it's going to depend on the rank achieved at the time and how much was offered in return for days of service. Again, for Virginia enlistees, those bounties could be redeemed in Kentucky and the Virginia Military Tract in present-day Ohio. And that's one example of state reserved lands. And Ohio becomes a really interesting construct when we look at the land there, because we were trying to finally use a thing not called metes and bounds, but rather the thing that we do today when we are measuring land. And it didn't work out at first. How did I do that? So let's see if it's going to let me do this, or if it's decided to have a mind of its own. Be aware that the government was usually a day late and $1 short, so that many rights to pensions for instance, the Revolutionary War, some of those didn't become available until 50 or 60 years later. And a lot of those people were dead by that time. And so you also have to look not only at what people were entitled to, but what the pension rights said. And you're going to have to look carefully at everything to do with it. So you really can't look at lands that were granted, bounty lands, without looking at military pensions and actual military service records. And fortunately, we do have those. Those are not uniform, so you're going to have to look at the legislation. But NARA, that is the National Archive, has a great overview, all in 1.5 pages of the federal legislation so that you can look to see how your people were affected. The state legislation can also be seen at NARA, guiding you to even more state sites that will tell you even more about what states did give land and when they gave it. New York, Virginia, Pennsylvania, several states gave land and made sure that the land that they'd had extending westward was included for that. But they all differ depending on the state. I want you to be aware of experts and their helps. Early on, before we got started with this presentation, I told you about a lady by the name of Dr. Arlene Akel. She is a wonderful, wonderful researcher, still working today in her 80s. She has her own private library just over the border in Utah of 70,000, count it, 70,000 books that have to do with genealogy. She goes out to work frequently with difficult problems that people bring to her for money. She does that. She is a professional researcher, so be aware of that. But all of her various blogs are free. Now, I'm only making you aware of one today, but here it is. You can go out and just look for Dr. Arlene Akel if you want to, E-A-K-L-E, and you'll see at her site this particular one with Bounty Land Warrants Key to Early Kentucky Ancestors. She has many other blog items, and they are well worth your time. So sign up with her. You're going to see things like catch-all acts. The Catch-all Act of 1850 was after, it was after the Revolutionary War. It was after various early Indian wars. It was after the Mexican War, and we were aware of the fact that we had to begin to catch up with this thing. Land had been promised to people, but the legislature, the U.S. legislature, did not get it into decent language so that the land could be given. And so even though people applied, sometimes they sat in nowhere land, without their land, for quite a long time. The Catch-all Act of 1850 was designed to look at the land for those who had served in war previous to 1790 and they'd not gotten a warrant. They had to prove that. Now remember, this is 55 years easily, 60 years after the Revolutionary War. But they were still talking about the Revolutionary War people and still talking about various wars like the War of 1812 for people who had not gotten their land. Soldiers who had served 9 months got 160 acres. If you served 4 months, you got 80. If you served 1 month, you got 40. But it was all a big mess by that time because so many of these people were deceased. So your answer is, first of all, and again, Rita, looking at this, the answer is to look for the compiled service files and the pensions in the first place, because you may find reference there to bounty land that was available, even if they hadn't applied for it, or bounty land that they had been given. Some of those files have been folded together. It is not uniform. I have looked for sure at one that I thought had to be uniform. It just had to be there. Well, it wasn't. But the compiled service file for people in the Revolutionary War, in the War of 1812, in the Mexican War, and in some smaller Indian wars, etc., oftentimes includes the information for the pension or tells you where to get that pension. And you always want to look at all of those pieces of information, not just one of them. Now, I'm going to tell you, fold 3, at least for some of this, does a great job. We'll look at that in a little while. But remember, you're consulting the good first-rate kinds of references at NARA. That's the National Archives. Fold 3 has taken its information from largely NARA, the National Archives. And of course, Family Search has followed through and gives you another avenue along with their wonderful Wikipedia. Pension data may refer to land or even the acts which specified the right to apply for the land. So take time to read all that. Don't just look for that precious piece of pension data because the land was not given automatically. You had to apply for it. They did not make it easy for these people, even though they had made various promises. The compiled military service records include card abstracts from muster rolls, pay vouchers, references. It can be to even a wound that somebody got, or their hospitalization, which may be a total surprise to you, or their absence from a unit, or their death, or every once in a while, you might even see a courts-martial. There will be frequently letters and commentaries from officers. They might be, in the muster rolls, those are those pay vouchers. They go together. The neat thing about these is they are date specific to the time of service, and they are also usually rank specific. There are then, since we need to consider 3 kinds of records, the compiled service records are available for Revolutionary War soldiers, for soldiers who fought in the War of 1812. And remember, these would not always be state units. That's not the way they did the War of 1812. For early Indian wars, if they had been referred to by colonial times when colonies gave land, or for other specific wars. For the Mexican War, there's compiled service records for the Civil War, but you need to be careful. If you are looking for records from the South, those are still largely at the states. A few of these things are being digitized, so you have to watch because that's a rapidly changing picture. But by and large, anything for the South can be seen within their states. There's also compiled service records for the Spanish-American War volunteers and the Philippine insurrection. That's the last conflict for which they have actually been able to complete all those compiled records so that you can be sure of it. And one way to check that is to go out and look at NARA. Well, they were a further incentive to serve, and they were a reward actually for military service. And so I'm going to ask you again always to remember that the bounty lands were largely reserved just for 4 big things: the Revolutionary War, War of 1812, the Mexican War, and those various kinds of Indian War conflicts. 1755, note that early date, still as colonies, through 1855, and they did not finish up granting the Indian War bounty lands until 1929. That's very interesting. The land warrant information that you get will include the name of the veteran, the rank on discharge, including hopefully their company, their regiment, their branch of service, the date of the warrant, and the land location, we hope. And sometimes there's just this thing called a warrant stub. That's very valuable. Watch it because it stands for a land warrant. It'll give you the warrant number in a different format, the name, rank, and regiment of the veteran, the date of the location, and where you can find this from abstracts of military bounty land warrant locations. So it can be helpful to you when you've exhausted every other avenue and you think you're never going to find this particular thing. Sometimes I'll warn you, these things have been scanned, but you're going to have to look at everything. They are not well indexed. Keep in mind that your particular veteran may have just used a first and last name, may have used a first and a middle initial, a first and a middle name, and so on. And keep all of those in mind when you're searching. These things can be very simple or they can be complex, and they may have been granted by a state. Maine was actually part of Massachusetts early on. They were called the District of Maine. in just a second, we're going to look at just the first part of a land warrant from Maine, because Maine's stuff is very, very complex, neatly so. It's handwritten, I'll warn you, not always easy to read, but worth your taking the time to scan it and look at it. And it specified all the service units and all the ways in which a particular person served. The advantage for these Maine lands, for you looking at them, is that they are gathered together so that you can pretty well see them in book after book instead of having to go under separate times. So here we are with Joseph Waterhouse. And he is at this point living in a place in a county in Maine. He's 82 when he finally applies for this, because the legislature of Maine passed on March 17, 1835, a resolve in favor of certain officers and soldiers of the Revolutionary War and the widows of the deceased officers and soldiers, and gave them the opportunity to apply for a pension and whatever. And so this is a pretty neat thing, because this man details where he enlisted in Scarborough, which was later in Maine, but at that point it was in Massachusetts, in the colony of Massachusetts. He enlisted in the year 1777 in a certain company. He transferred to another company and so on, so that they could follow his record. This is just the first page of 2 pages detailing what he had done and why he was asking for this. By the way, Waterhouse got this particular thing that he asked for. How did I find that Waterhouse application? Well, it was pretty easy, folks. I went out to Family Search, and in there, when I was looking at those Revolutionary War bounty land applications, I found out that Maine had done some pretty interesting things. They'd taken those applications for those 3 years, 1835 through 1838, and there were a little over 10,000 people who applied, so it's not small, and they've been scanned, and you can browse them. The interesting thing there, of course, is they've made them available in small bundles or units, so you're not having to look forever and ever. So that's one way to begin to look for something like this. I believe Pennsylvania has done something similar. Examples available at Family Search. Here's another one. This one served in the War of 1812. His name was Hugh Cannon. He was a private in the 42nd Regimental Infantry. Notice that there's no state assigned. That's because states did not always sign up in regiments in the War of 1812. It was done differently. But Hugh Cannon got a permit for 160 acres of land, and it's available out at Family Search. I've given you this, but you can look at it, and these are really neat. It says, pursuant to the second section of an act of Congress passed the 6th of May, 1812, it authorized the Secretary of War to issue land warrants to non-commissioned officers and soldiers who were in the service of the U.S. From anybody who was in service from the 26th of December, 1811 through January 11, 1812, which concerns this particular person. It says he's late a private in the company commanded by Captain Biddle of the 42nd Regiment Infantry, and he's entitled to 160 acres, and it's signed off by the acting Secretary of War at that point on the 25th day of October. So it can be as easy as this to find it, because these, again, I'm going to caution you, I found these separated from the actual documents certifying their service. So these are different again. So don't give up your looking. Remember, the Indigenous Wars, or the removal of tribes and more, also created and gave opportunities for bounty bounty lands, and they could be used in military districts like early Ohio. It wasn't just Virginia who settled there. Sometimes in order to get right to a file, if you're just looking for bounty land, you need that congressional act which authorized the warrant and the acreage, because they're slightly different. When I look at the things for the Mexican War, people served such varying amounts of time that those are split out and they require some real research. The date limits go from 1775 to 1855, and occasionally those add-ons where somebody said, hey, I didn't get my land, can I get it now? Through 1929. They're covered by some interesting things. When you look for bounty land applications, make sure that you're also looking for the pension books. For instance, the pension books of 1819, 1820 actually cover people who were Revolutionary War vets who were still alive. And they also covered, for example, the War of 1812, just to name two of those. Sometimes you'll find them in the pensioner's file. Go look at that service file where it's available, because I think that's one of your best bets. It's no secret. People wanted short-term outcomes for themselves. So land speculators made hay just the way they had when land was first offered to people right after colonial times. From the very first grants, speculators took advantage. They got veterans to assign, that is, turn it over to them in return for a certain amount of cash. Hey, if he was a veteran and he was in Upper Maine and he was being offered some of the land from Massachusetts that actually ran out and over into what is today Illinois, sometimes they took the vet took the cash and ran. The government still kept trying to get all bounty land holders to actually be settlers because they wanted people in those Western lands. But those things got sold on the open market. So sometimes you'll see them actually turned over to someone. You'll say, I wonder why that happened. That was in all likelihood a land speculator who, again, turned that land over to someone else. And that bounty land was actually settled by someone who was not a veteran. We talked about cadastral elements and maps being important, and they become important to us in 1785. Before 1785, largely we used constructs in measuring land that actually came from colonists who were from England, from France, and so on. And so they were described in terms of metes and bounds. And you'll still see lots of land today, for example, in Pennsylvania, that is described that way, in Maryland, and so on. But we were even then in 1785 beginning to look at cadastral elements, defining the principal meridian, which had actually been defined way before that, the numbered section, the township, and the range. And they were trying to do something about that and doing their best to measure the land in 1785, but they really got ahead of themselves. So don't be surprised to see other measurements entering in if you're looking at early land grants for especially Revolutionary War vets and those early Indian wars, or the War of 1763 and so on. Here's a look at what I've been referring to at Ohio. If you'll notice, over in the green on the left side of the screen, you've got the second principal meridian baseline that is established there, and not far from it to the right, you see the first principal meridian, which was actually, I believe, put together in about 1790 or so, 1799. And baselines are established, but guess what? There were still Virginia military surveys that entered in there that had been done previous to this, 1797 baselines and so on. And so you will see a mixed bag if you are looking there, or you are looking at the land for Kentucky, Virginia, Massachusetts, and frankly, for some of those things that I talked about in Maine. Here's another map that you can find right out at Family Search, showing that they attempted that point of beginning rectangular system of surveys. You'll see this over on the right. with Ellicott's line in 1785. But Congress got a little too wordy and really messed things up. So we worked a continual amount of time and a long time to really get this rectangular system of surveys right. The Public Land Ordinance of 1785 was given to raise monies they needed to continue paying off that Revolutionary War expense, to grant lands in lieu of pay, because they don't have any money to pay the soldiers, or not a lot, to okay that Western migration, and then one other thing, to officially okay where people had already migrated to. Because even though there'd been a line there when they were colonies, people didn't pay a lot of attention to that. And so that migration had already started. For instance, there was a place called Lexington, Kentucky, whose name was received actually on that day when the colonists charged against the British back in Massachusetts in 1776. Well, that meant there had to be a considerable number of people there in what became Lexington, Kentucky. And yes, they'd gone beyond the boundaries. There was a land ordinance of 1785, which was again looked at in 1776, and yikes, the Congress made it not workable. It called for the surveys, get this, to be both rectangular and have sides running in the cardinal directions. It's an impossibility on our planet where the meridians converge as they reach the poles. So that 1796 law attempted to fix things, but it didn't. At Fold 3, this is one of the best places I've seen for you to be able to find the Indian and Mexican-American wars and find records about these people. They're not very complex, but they are there. There's 35 million of these records at Fold 3. So check it out. We may not be aware of what we looked like or what we were fighting about. The disputed territories that I'm showing you on these two particular maps that I got out at NARA. But if you're looking at unorganized territories and where we were, and the fact that Texas wanted to be its own republic, and then it decided that it wanted to become the United States, it's no wonder that we had this conflict going on 1846 to 1848, and that we gained a lot of this land way over to the west. So they granted Mexican War bounties under the Act of 1847, and widows and veterans became eligible for the pensions not until 1887, 40 years later. So you can see, again, I'm going to tell you, the government was a day late, $1 short. They had to prove they were honorably discharged, difficult to do when you're searching those records, and maybe the man you served under was long dead and the records had not been given to someone above him. But there are considerable available records out at Family Search also. So Family Search is one more place to really search and look at records when you cannot find them at Fold 3. I'm in for all of it, I guess. If I'd looked at Fold 3 and I thought I found something, I'm still going to be looking over at Family Search because I want to know if they found something else. You'll also see this interesting Mormon Battalion bounty land application that was given especially to Mormons. And we have a book in our library, I know, and I put it on your list, but you're also able to find those out at the Family Search, and record group 15 has been pretty well worked over for this particular one. So if your family was at that point LDS, you may want to look there. The Indian Wars are available. Bounty Land Acts of 1850, 52, and 1855 granted warrants for service in all Indian wars from 1790 up to the beginning of the Civil War. Now, interestingly, they also offered some of this land very occasionally to Indians who were scouts. So be watching that. The name and the index to the Indian War pension files are available also from the National Archives, but they've not really begun working on these yet. I want you to think about how to access these original sources, because many of us just can't travel to them. So go out and look at NARA. They're constantly changing, and they have things all of the time where people are volunteering into projects to give more access to people. So if you want to be part of a project, look out there. The Library of Congress has a lot of maps and a lot of images that would be interesting to you. Same with the Archive Grid. AmericanAncestors.org is the New England Society, and they have quite a bit, and they've done quite a bit with their records. The American Antiquarian Society Library in Massachusetts is also a great place to look, and they are gradually gaining a presence out on the internet. Cindy's List can help you. State historical societies, especially for any of those original 13 colonies, can help you. And of course, Genealogy Bank has this really neat thing besides newspapers. They have all of the congressional records there. And so who knows when you'll find your person actually listed. You can actually search for names there. Take action by finding these land transactions and recording them for yourself. Make an exact transcription. Don't short on this. They're vital to your research and your conclusions and what your relatives are going to say later on. Instead of just saying, well, I think we had some of that land, we got a whole bunch of it, make it really specific. If I were you, I would be following it down, in fact, to that particular piece of land and who owns it today. But that's just me. I would say be thorough. Determine what happened to the land. You can look when you get right down to it, and at state level, all of those things, once you have the information about that land grant, you can look at it at county record level. And you can look at deeds, maybe the first one, so you can see the string of owners after it was sold or it was abandoned or occasionally relinquished or had to be given up because their claim was proven untrue. We had a few people who said more than their prayers. You can provide a summary of what became of the family's military land grant as documented through later land records. So follow that land. It's interesting. And if you're going to take a road trip, I can't think of a better road trip to take. Then, of course, don't forget to add the documents and the sources to your genealogy database, whatever you're using. And if you're using paper, don't forget to add at least a chapter onto your family story about these unique land record resources. Ensure that you've scanned what you have right now, because who knows what someone else is going to find later on. Label them accurately for the time you're in right now so others know what you found and where you found it. Provide an explanation that tells about your very exciting journey as you found these records and why this document and its source was important to your research about your family. So that's a fast overview, people, of military bounty land warrants and grants. Gary.
In the case of Great Falls, Montana, every beginning story of Great Falls begins with military scrip being exchanged for land.
Yes, it does.
And so the details of that have to be pretty exotic.
They do, Gary, because by then, of course, we're talking like 1885, 1886, 1887. And by then, things were thought to be pretty well settled among especially the revolutionary scrip that was given and later scrip. But there were some things that had been contended through court. And I rather suspect that at least that one particular grant that they got, I can tell you they got it in the first few months that people were seeking land here, that it had to have been gotten through that. So I think we'd have to go over and look at the land and see what that is. But we know that at least one was there, yes, from revolutionary times, which is pretty cool. Now, remember, sometimes the acts of Congress specified that heirs could go after it. They more often said that widows could go after the land. But you can also look at heirs. And remember, you have to look at states that specified that, because there was a lot of that going on in Virginia. So that's one state I do know about.